And this beast is the portrayal of the Roman Empire, which is really kind of a puppet for Satan. And there's another beast that is revealed also in chapter 13, and it's a phony lamb. It's a beast that looks like a lamb. It has two horns, but what it basically is promotes the image. It's kind of a publicity agent for the empire. And knowing what was going on in the culture of that times, the phony lamb is the religion that grew up around Rome that promoted the worship of the emperor and the worship of the gods of Rome. And so these two beasts together are being utilized by Satan in order to deceive the populace of Rome and deceive the nations. And so that's the backstory for what it is that's going on right now. In chapter 14, we have then, we've seen the enemy, and now we see the answer to a question that's raised in chapter 13. Who can stand against the beast? Who can make war with the beast? And the answer to that is found at the beginning of chapter 14 with a picture of the people of God who've been numbered for war. And so there are 144,000 who stand with the Lamb. We've got the beast standing on the sea. We've got the little beast, the phony lamb, that's standing on the land. We've got the dragon who is pulling the strings for both of them. And then on the other side of the battlefield are the 144,000 who stand with the Lamb, and they are standing on Mount Zion, and they are ready to go to war. They are devoted to their captain, and they're allegiant to him. But what we see then is not a battle. What we see instead are these announcements that are made by angels that it's all done. The first angel comes and says that is an angel that's described as as preaching the good news. But it's not a good news of salvation in Christ. It's a good news of judgment for those who've rejected salvation. And so the first angel comes in verse 6 and pronounces the fact that the good news is that judgment is coming on the enemy. A second angel comes and pronounces that the enemy has fallen. And instead of using the name Rome, the name Babylon, the city Babylon's name is pronounced. Fallen is Babylon the Great, because Babylon was the old captor of God's people, and Rome is the new captor. And so fallen is the new Babylon, is basically the sentiment of the second angel. And then a third angel comes and says that everyone who's received the mark of the beast is going to be judged, is going to suffer torment without rest. And so a warning for folks not to be seduced by and not to be taken in by, or to give in out of coercion to the worship of Rome and her emperor. And then after the three warnings, there's a voice of assurance saying, "Blessed are those who die in the Lord from now on," because unlike those who've worshipped the beast, they will have rest from their labors, and they will have rest for eternity. And then, as I said, instead of a battle, there are two reapings that are described. One that's a reaping of the righteous and one that's a reaping of the wicked. And so, rather than there being a warfare, the Lord gives a sickle to His angel, and they just mow down the world. In the first image, it's Christ who's harvesting the grain, and so He swings a sickle, and all of the righteous are gathered to Him. In the second picture, it's a grape harvest, and the sickle, instead of being swung by Jesus, is swung by an angel, and He reaps all of the grapes, and the grapes are put into a vat, and they are trampled like you would do with pressing grapes in order to make wine. Except the grapes here are people. They are those they are the enemy. And it says that the blood from the trampling of the grapes flows out of the city for 200 miles and as deep as a horse's bridle, giving a picture of just the utter annihilation of those that have been the enemies of God's people. And so 12, 13, and 14, that's the picture of the enemy and of the fact that their end is certain. Satan has always failed in all of his attempts to foil God's purposes, and he will fail again. What he's doing and raising up this empire and raising up this religion that is persecuting the followers of the Lamb, all of it will utterly fail. And so it's given that assurance to God's people that's going to be the end for this enemy. As terrifying as the enemy might look, its end is known and is certain. Well, that picture is painted again in chapters 15 and 16. And this time it happens, as we've seen before, in terminology that's reminiscent of the Exodus. And so the first picture we see is of the people of God standing on a sea of glass, and we talked about that last time, that this is a better Exodus, because these are not, the followers of the Lamb didn't walk through the sea on dry land. They didn't come through a crisis where God parted the waters. These followers of Jesus, they walk on top of the water rather than through the water on dry land. And the water under their feet is like glass. It's a pavement. But it's not just a sea, it's a sea of fire. And yet they stand atop of it because they are people that have come out of persecution. They've come out of suffering. And yet they are standing victorious. And they're not even thinking about the fire or the sea beneath their feet because they're all caught up in praise. And so they're holding their harps and they're singing praise to God. And so they are complete victors and celebrating in the face of this enemy. And as they are celebrating and as they are singing, there are 7 angels that come out of the temple, and they are carrying these 7 bowls that have been handed to them, and these bowls are filled up with the wrath of God. And so it's going to be another picture. We've already seen one picture of judgment. Here's a second picture of judgment, and it's going to be the pouring out of these plagues. The point I want you to see in the people standing on the sea of glass in the presence of God as the angels are going out and as they're carrying the bowls of wrath is that the people of God are portrayed here as being participants in this judgment that's about to be poured out. And so, we usually when we look back at the Exodus, the crossing of the Red Sea came after the plagues. But here, they're already acting victorious. They're already standing as victors before the plagues have been poured out. Just another way of communicating the certainty of victory and the certainty of the judgment on the enemy. And so they stand as victors on the sea of glass. The angels come out with their 7 plagues. And in chapter 16 then, they begin pouring out the plagues. I said to you at the end of class last week that the plagues have a connection to the trumpets that we read about earlier. Because remember, when the trumpets were warning judgments. They were judgments. They had the roar of the lion and the fact that they were judgments, but they also had the mercy of the Lamb in them, because the judgments were escalating. They started with not hurting man directly with the first plague. It wasn't until you got to the 5th plague in that series that man is affected directly. And they were always partial. It was always a third of whatever that was affected. A third of the crops, a third of the sea, a third of the rivers, a third of the sun, the moon, and the stars. Man was tormented, but he wasn't killed by the plague that came on him from the locusts in the 5th trumpet. And so there was mercy that was an element of all of those judgments. No more. The bowls of wrath are not like the trumpets. There are echoes of the trumpets in the bowls of wrath, but the bowls of wrath are final judgments. This is destruction. And so you see that in all 7 of these elements of these bowls as they're poured out. And there's a relationship between each of these bowls and the trumpets that came earlier. And so the first bowl of wrath is poured out, and the fact that this is more and this is final is communicated in the difference between the the first bowl of wrath and the first trumpet. The first trumpet affected a third of the vegetation. And so it's the most harmless, if you could call them harmless, it's the most harmless of the trumpets in that it was the furthest away from man. It didn't affect man directly. But when we come to the bowls of wrath, the first bowl of wrath is poured out on man directly. And so it doesn't affect the crops. Man is the one who's directly affected. And so there's a malignant, we're told, and painful sore that is the result of this bowl of wrath that's poured out on humanity. And everyone is touched. It's not just a third, it's everyone. And so we're prepared for how serious the bowls of wrath are with the pouring out of the first one. The second one is poured out, and like the second trumpet, it's the sea that's affected. But not just a third of the sea is turned to blood this time. This time, the entire sea is turned to blood. And in order to paint the picture of just how abysmal and how terrible it is, it's described as the blood of a corpse, of a dead man. And so the whole sea is turned to blood. Everything that's in the sea dies. And so it's total destruction is the picture that's painted here. Then the rivers are affected with the pouring out of the third bowl. And it's like the third trumpet, which affected the rivers. But rather than the waters being turned bitter, this time all of the waters are turned to blood just like the sea. And so the rivers run with blood all throughout the land. And there is a conversation that takes place. I can't remember if it's the angels or who it is that says it, but yeah. There's an angel that says in verse 5 of chapter 16 that this is just, this judgment that's given on the enemy because they had poured out the blood of the saints. They had poured out the blood of the Christians, and so now God is giving them blood to drink. And so it's a just or righteous judgment for the way that they've rejected God and the violent way in which they have not only rejected Him, but then have persecuted His people. The fifth plague is a plague on, the fourth plague, the fourth bowl that's poured out, is on the luminaries again, the same way that the fourth trumpet was. Except this time, rather than the sun being darkened and the moon being darkened and the stars being darkened, a third of them as it was in the earlier judgment, this time the sun scorches mankind. And so man is burned by the sun is the picture that's being painted here. And just like the people of God are participants in this judgment, this righteous judgment against the wicked, so it is that all creation is really pictured in all of these judgments as being participants in this punishment. And so I want you to see that in the fact that the sun is scorching man. It's that the sun, too, recognizes that this is deserved, that creation has from the beginning of time been cursed because of man's sin, and it's been waiting for the fulfillment of God's promise in the redemption of all creation. And so creation itself is participating in the judgment on the wicked as the sea is turned to blood and as the rivers run with blood and as the sun now scorches. And we'll see how it comes to a climax when the seventh bowl is poured out. That brings us to number 6. And the sixth bowl that is poured out is a picture of the Euphrates River being dried up. If you remember the sixth trumpet, what happened there was this army from the east that marched over, and it had the horses were described as having tails that were serpents, and as having the mouths of lions, and the horses breathed fire and smoke and brimstone. And the riders didn't even swing the sword. The people were killed by the breath of the horses as they rode across the land. And the picture that was being painted there was of the fact that God had it within His power to totally annihilate the enemy. And yet only a third is affected by that plague when it's unleashed. Well, here it's also a picture of the army from the east, and this is not a picture of some historical army Again, as we read Revelation, we're not seeing a calendar of events that's going to unfold. This army is God's army that comes from the east. That's where God is. He comes from the east, and He's often portrayed that way in prophecies and in pictures of him coming to save, or in Him coming to judge. And so the drying up of the Euphrates just means that there's no barrier now for the enemy to come in, for the army to come in and to trample the enemy. So the drying up of the Euphrates paves the way so that this army from the east can come in and can destroy the enemy of God's people. And so that plague dries up the river, makes it possible for that to take place. Then we have the pouring out. All right, well, before the pouring out of the seventh plague, something else happens. You'll notice, if you would, in verse 13, that the dragon and the two beasts have a response to these bowls of wrath that are poured out. You'll notice that the third beast is not described here as a beast. What's he called? False prophet, yeah. So it gives us some picture of how our earlier conclusion about what this beast was is accurate. That the third beast that was described as a beast that came up out of the land, that looked like a lamb, that had the two horns and all of that, and that was compelling people and persuading people to worship the beast that came out of the sea, that he's described here as being a false prophet. And so I think our conclusions are correct, that this third beast and this false prophet all had to do with the religion that grew up around, that promoted Rome and its power and the divinity of its emperors. And so we have the dragon